Everyone, this is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the Humanities Teaching app. We're doing a little bit of a first today. I'm here with my friend Eric Connor, and we're going to discuss the poem Lament of Edward II. And Eric was kind enough to prepare some questions for us, and we're just going to go through these sequentially.
Thank you, Luke.
And I think the first one is, I'd like for you to introduce the topic of the Lament of Edward II, and tell us a little bit about this Anglo-Norman French chanson. When was it written?
Yeah, so this is a particular lament written sometime between 1327, the death, right before the death of Edward II of England, King of England, and when the two versions of it were preserved in manuscripts dated roughly 1350. So we're looking at the middle of the 14th century as the cutoff point for when they were written. They were written basically no later than that point. And it's a lament in the chanson, Anglo-Norman poetic style, meaning it would have been a lyric poem where there would have been music, little flute players and minstrels and people singing along with it. And it would have been polyphonic, meaning that there would have been several singers who would have had a harmony going, where they would have like octaves, different octaves to make it sound pretty. Like you go to a church, you hear a choir, right. You hear the different octaves to make the choir song sound more pronounced and harmonic. So it would have been sort of an orchestral sort of piece,
right?
And it really this type of poetry, lyric poetry, developed out of an even earlier tradition going back to the 13th century with troubadours doing was it the canso? I hope I'm not butchering it.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Process over perfection here.
So the chanson sort of it evolved out of that an earlier genre of single troubadours singing various songs, usually secular songs. But this song is pretty fascinating in that it's both political and religious.
I see.
It serves two different goals there, and it can fall into either one of those genres, secular or religious, because of the nature of the poem and the amount of religious invocation in the song, talking about God and sin and repentance, and so it's not a typical 14th century Anglo-Norman poem in that regard. It's got a really powerful political message as well.
So let me ask you this. All right, so off camera I've had to ask you, what the heck is Anglo-Norman, right? So I would need a little bit of background for people who are perhaps not familiar with what we're talking about here. What is Anglo-Norman French, right? And then second of all, why did you choose this? I said, Eric, I'm trying to develop the historical aspect of the Noetic teaching platform and everything like that. So this is sort of a trial balloon for how we would do it. But we'll use some sort of particular historical thing, like a poem, as a springboard for a larger conversation. Yes. Why did you choose this particular poem?
Right. So to address the first question, Anglo-Norman, what is Anglo-Norman?
Yes.
Well, Anglo-Norman French is a variety of the French language spoken 1,000 to 800 years ago as a court language of the Norman conquerors after they invaded England in 1066 and won at the Battle of Hastings. Mm-hmm. So William, the guy who conquered England in the year 1066, he spoke French from Normandy, the northern region of France, that dialect of French, and with the Norman invasion and conquest of England, the court language for the English kings and the royal court and the aristocracy and the scholarly community, even the church, some of the church members, if they weren't speaking Latin, was Anglo-Norman French. Middle English didn't. It was, even though it was used sometimes as an administrative language, and it was obviously the language of the commoners. It was not the language of high society and poetry, which was really the reserve of Anglo-Norman French.
I see.
Yeah.
So why did you gravitate towards this particular poem?
So I gravitated towards this particular poem because it's really, depositions and didn't happen very often in English history. Edward II, when he was deposed in 1327, was a shocking, traumatic event for the country, for the Kingdom of England at the time, and obviously a major international event, because at the time there was wars going on between both France and Scotland, and the deposition of this king led directly to peace with both of those countries. Well, at least a temporary peace.
Right.
Peace for the time being. So, but it was also represented a constitutional crisis for the English monarchy. And as we'll jump into it a little later in this podcast. It had to be dressed up and treated very delicately by those who were deposing the monarch, who were knocking Edward II from power.
Right.
So they understood the gravity of deposing a monarch and then later having him wind up dead while he's in prison, and what sort of ramifications that would have down the road for English history. I thought this is a great sort of object lesson of how the 14th century mindset existed in the royal court and high society. Plus, it gives you a window into how people viewed monarchy, royal power, and the failings of monarchs at the time. And for Noetic particularly, I think it's just a great example of how we can take a really in-depth look at a historical topic, make it interesting, make it relatable, and hopefully teach some people about an aspect of English history that they weren't really familiar with before.
Well, if nothing else, I'm definitely learning a lot.
Yeah.
So let's move on to our second prepared question. So I guess maybe tell us a little bit more about the man behind the poem, Edward II, his reign, his estranged wife, Isabella, his favorite and possible gay lover, Piers Gaveston, his deposition by his wife and her lover, Roger Mortimer, 1st Earl of March, and his death and or possible assassination in 1327.
Precisely. Yep. The reign of Edward II for him was really unfortunate one. He never really seemed, or many scholars have come to this consensus that he seemed like a reluctant monarch. He didn't really seem like he was very interested in ruling. Hence his proclivity towards delegating responsibility to his favorites. He had two different favorites throughout his reign. We'll get to them in a moment. He had the misfortune of coming right after one of the most successful and powerful monarchs in English history, Edward I, his father. And he wasn't even supposed to be king originally, but his older brother, Alphonse, died before Edward II died in 1307. So the crown had to be passed on to the next eldest son, Edward II. So, Edward II was unpopular almost from the start, especially with the coronation. On this coronation day, he paid very little attention to his wife, Isabel, who he had already had children with. And people then were even noticing that he was ignoring her, and at that particular feast, paying almost all of his attention exclusively to Piers Gaveston, his favorite, who would become his favorite during his reign. And by that I mean a person who he would delegate a lot of royal responsibility to. He would provide him with lots of privilege in terms of access and wealth. And this was deeply unpopular. The barons and the nobility of England were already voicing their concerns about Piers Gaveston, and they eventually entered open rebellion, which had a precedent early in English history. If you know the Magna Carta, the Magna Carta was a century before this, and it came about because of a war that the barons of England had with the King John. So when the barons rose up in rebellion against Edward II, it was a very similar situation. They thought that their voices weren't heard. They wanted some sort of reform in government. They wanted better treatment in terms of how the crown delegated authority and wealth and lands, and Edward II, being the aloof monarch that he was, let Piers Gaveston deal with the barons whenever they called Parliament.
Wow.
And Piers Gaveston was an absolutely caustic figure who would insult people, call them dogs, and people he would call nobility. For example, I think he called one the dog of Warwick.
So was it well understood? Was this sort of an open secret what his relationship to Edward II was, or how? What was the perception of Piers Gaveston?
The thing is, we don't even. I mean, monarchs throughout history have had favorites, royal favorites. We don't even know if Edward truly was gay or bisexual. It's all insinuation. Although we can sort of see from his behavior and how he reacted when Piers Gaveston was eventually executed, captured in battle and executed.
Oh.
The vengeance he took, the fury he took to kill the people who, like for example Lancaster, who were responsible for his favorite's death. He tortured them to death and then had them killed. Now, mind you, there's lots of torture and death in medieval history, but this was particularly nasty. And also his behavior whenever they demanded that Piers Gaveston be exiled. Whenever Piers Gaveston was exiled, or one time when he was exiled, and he was exiled not once, more times than one time, he was actually made Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. So, breaking with his oath that he was going to have him exiled to France, for example, and Piers Gaveston originally came from France, from the Gascon region. He instead decided to make him Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. So you can see how he favors him. He cares about Piers Gaveston a lot. He cares about his role with the crown. And when Piers Gaveston eventually falls and is executed, Edward II unleashes his wrath on those who had him killed. Now, his next royal favorite, though, I don't think there's no speculation that Edward II had any sort of romantic relationship with this man, Hugh Despenser. There's no discussion about his sexuality, but aside from him being heterosexual, and that's not in question. But there's certainly lots of discussion about Piers Gaveston's sexuality and was he gay or not, or bisexual. But just to be clear, though, I think given the fact that Edward II had a mistress even outside of his wife Isabella, he had a bastard son named Adam in the year. I forget exactly which year, but he did have a bastard son with a woman outside of his marriage with Isabella of France. So, at best, this man was a bisexual.
So let me ask you this. So how does this all play into the lament? What is Edward II lamenting? Is he lamenting the retributive actions that he took as the result of things that were done to Piers Gaveston, or the mistress? I mean, what is this a reaction to? Where does this poem come from? What's the general source?
This is a great question. This is a very strange poem in that the woman who he sent to France to his wife Isabella goes there, allies with his enemy Roger Mortimer, becomes Roger Mortimer's lover, comes back to England, then has Edward II deposed. In his lament, he's it's sort of like a classic Anglo-Norman love song, sort of trope where he's talking, "Oh, my love lady has been lost, and I'm lamenting that I've lost such a fair lady." But it's almost uncharacteristic of Edward II to do that, given how the really bitter war they had, where she literally invaded England from France with her lover Mortimer, and had him deposed. And then when he sent his son Edward III to France to pay homage to the French king, which is a usual thing that English monarchs did. They considered the French king their superior, who they paid tribute to. When his son Edward III went there and did that, she basically, Isabella basically got her hands on him and then wouldn't let him go back to England. And then when she invaded England with Mortimer, Edward III was at her side. So this is not a woman who he's really going to be lamenting and lamenting over with love lost. I don't think there was much love there to begin with. And given the sources and what the chroniclers at least say, it doesn't seem like there was much, affection between the two. They had 4 children,
right?
But not a lot of. I would say not a lot of affection. So the poem is strange in that the poem itself is set up like a religious sort of repentance, where he talks about his sins and his faults and giving too much authority to his favorites and not paying attention to the political climate and the barons. And he eventually, but at the very end of the poem, the one other curious mention of Isabella, indirectly I would say, is that he's talking about his son Edward III, who he only talks about positively. And he refers to Edward III as the stag, the young stag, who he hopes will rise up and savage his enemies, the treacherous enemies who may wrong him. So this is seems like almost a jab at Isabella and Mortimer. Now, this is we'll get to that later. We'll get to that in a moment. In terms of the intent of that passage, but I would say in the Lament, it paints her as being a beautiful lady who he misses, but I just think it's not characteristic of the man himself. I don't imagine Edward II being in his jail cell, being, "Oh, my wife, oh, Isabella, how could I have how could I have lost your love?" Right. I think he would have been cursing her name, in my personal opinion.
And that was something I was going to ask. From the little bit that I have been able to read and research on this poem, is that it seems like it's something that occurred within a jail cell during that deposition. Like, I'm not exactly sure what it meant for royalty to be deposed, but is that how people should understand it? That he's writing this from a prison cell?
So this is the tricky part here.
Right,
the authorship of
the authorship.
Was it really written by Edward II?
But that's the story.
Exactly.
That's the story that's told.
Exactly.
That this was written from a jail cell.
Yes, that's what's understood traditionally. Yes,
and you have here you wanted me
would
to
the
ask,
jailers let him do that?
Yeah, exactly. It just seems sort of strange that would be able to happen.
Yeah.
Was there something like forgiveness in this poem, or did this poem serve as an occasion for him to forgive his political?
Great
personal
question.
Tormentors.
Great question. So the chroniclers, the historians of the time, had him wailing, and when he was imprisoned and then deposed, they had him wailing and asking his forgiveness for his subjects. But in this poem, in this lament of Edward II, instead he's not wailing, he's praying, and he's not asking forgiveness from his subjects. He's not addressing his subjects. He's addressing God and asking God for forgiveness. So that's where the religious part comes in. But
so tell us a little bit about the authorship of the poem.
Right.
So you've opened this can of worms. It's the live question about whether or not he really did write the damn thing.
Did he?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of speculation. The traditional speculation was going back to Fabian, a translator into Middle English in the 16th century, that Edward II was indeed the authentic author of this poem. The 2 manuscripts that we have are dated roughly, like I said, to about 1350, and they looked like circulated versions of originals. So we know they're not like authentic signature versions of what he might have written if he did indeed write it at all. But I think there's significant evidence to suggest that it wasn't Edward II who wrote it. It was either a combination of different people or a specific courtier, perhaps at the court of his son Edward III later on, after Roger Mortimer, his regent, fell from grace and was in turn executed and charged with treason for earlier having Edward II, his father, killed. So the thing about this poem is that it seems to combine elements of propaganda that were put out by Isabella of France, Edward III's estranged wife, and Roger Mortimer, in that it depicts Edward II as very sorry and repentant for his sins and crimes, and it's so out of character for him, but it also serves the narrative that he was deserving of his deposition. And there's a part in the poem where he even talks about how he is ready to die. So really that would really service the argument of Isabella and Mortimer that he deserved to be replaced by his son. And speaking of which, after they had already deposed him, they set up legal documents to make it seem as though he abdicated, was not deposed, but abdicated willfully to his son Edward III, obviously under pressure and threat of an invading army, who had defeated him in battle.
Some abdication, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is something that will come up later with Richard II, who's going to be deposed later in the century, in the year 1399, by Henry IV, the Lancastrian, the second English king to be deposed in that century, the very end of it. That it seemed very convenient that this poem would include a lot of details about him lamenting his faults and then being prepared to die. And it seems very convenient that propaganda would be there. And it seems to reflect even the legal language that they were using with the abdication and first the deposition and then the abdication. Now, it also, however, has very sharp criticism of Mortimer and Isabella in the same poem. So what I would argue, and I think what Claire Valente would argue, who just wrote a wonderful article back in 2002 on the subject.
Do you know where people can find that? I mean, that article off the top of your head?
If you have access, I would go to JSTOR.
And what's the article called? I mean,
yeah, it's called The Lament of Edward II. And it was, the subtitle, I believe, was Religious Poetry. I can't remember.
But more importantly, the author's name again?
Yeah, it was Claire Valente, for the magazine Speculum by the Chicago University Press.
Okay, that should be enough information if someone wanted to find it.
Totally. So, I'm sorry, I forgot where we were.
Well, the other question I was going to ask you is if people wanted to look at this poem, right? I think there's a story about how this sort of came into the popular consciousness. It was discovered, was it not? I'm sort of jumping around here a little bit. I hope it's okay. But it was what I've read and researched or whatever, that this poem wasn't really known.
No,
right?
not really.
And,
right.
And then was it this Paul Struder guy who I read about who discovered it in a library or something somewhere? Right. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, yeah. Oh, yeah, certainly. Before we go further, I should clarify that. Yeah, it was found originally, or first translated into English from Anglo-Norman French in the 16th century by a guy named Fabian. And he neglected to mention that it was in Anglo-Norman French, the original. He translated one line into Latin and then the rest into English, right? So it wasn't translated or picked up again until the 1920s by Paul Studer.
Studer.
Yeah, 1920, in a 1921 publication.
And people, that's online. You can find
You can find that online.
Yeah, I believe the Internet Archive that's run by Google has Studer's original musings and translations of it.
You can go to archive.org for that.
Yes, yeah.
Definitely. And he offers his own critique. If I remember correctly, Studer was of the opinion that it was authored originally by Edward II. But I think this, Claire Valente, for example, and others, bring up, for example, I think her name was Aspen, Isabel Aspen, bring up evidence that it was more likely a courtier tied to Edward III's court. Now, I think this poem is a combination of both propaganda from Isabel and Mortimer's time, from between 1327 and 1330, when Mortimer exercised power over the English government when he had his regency over Edward III, the young Edward III, and propaganda that was put out by Edward III after he had Mortimer executed. After he came to his majority, took over the reins of power, made his mother Isabel retire into the background. She lived privately and comfortably for the rest of her life because he's going to treat his mother nicely. But her lover, Mortimer, he had him executed. So I think it's a combination of propaganda from Isabel and Mortimer, plus Edward III wanting to make things look like a smooth transition from Edward II's reign to his reign.
Right, of course.
And so he utilized their own propaganda for his own purposes and against them. Regarding his father, Edward II. So you can kind of... This poem, in terms of its authorship, it looks like it was a person, maybe a courtier of his court, maybe not. Maybe it's just someone from generic high society at the time. Some noble's court somewhere in England, where this poem sort of reflects both a criticism of Edward II and a willingness for him to step down and let his son rule, as well as a very sharp criticism of Mortimer and Isabel, both of whom were very unpopular because of their ending of the war with Scotland, which was deeply unpopular. Mind you, the Scottish were able to defeat Edward II at Bannockburn in 1314, which made Edward II in turn also unpopular in his own day. But this poem seems like a very convenient way for Edward III to show that his father had faults, but he wanted to rehabilitate his image a bit and make it seem as though he had high hopes for his son, Edward III. That he would be a wise leader, a stronger leader, that he would lash out at the enemies of their family and the royal power, and avenge him in a way. So this poem can really reflect two different strands of propaganda. An earlier set of propaganda aimed only at Edward II, as propagated by Isabella of France and Mortimer, and then Edward III once he took over the reins of power.
Cool. So we've talked a little bit about some of the translations and the research that's been done. Was there anything else that you want to add to the current manifestations or somewhat current manifestations? And then I guess the thing is like Anglo-Norman French is a dead language, right? And so we were fumbling around here. I was like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if you could read the poem, or I could, or something like that? And it's like, apparently you can't just jump into it. You can't just jump into the Middle English either.
Personally, I would butcher it.
Yeah, but
Anglo-Norman French. But
are there any performances of the poem that you know about? Like, how could so people were like, great, fantastic, we're learning all this history surrounding the poem, and that has a lot of educational value. Mm-hmm. How do we provide people with a recitation or a performance of it? Do you know of anything?
Yeah, unfortunately, this isn't the sort of thing that's just... Usually you can find really great audio versions of, old medieval songs and poems on YouTube. Even I mean, YouTube is a great even now. YouTube is a great repository for that.
Well, I'll let you in on a little secret. There's so much that hasn't been done.
Of course,
hence why we're making what we're making right now.
Exactly. I think it's good that we're even highlighting this poem at all, because there aren't any really readily available audio versions of it online. There just aren't. No one's bothered to make one. It's one of the more rare and arcane pieces of literature that doesn't really even get that much attention in academia. Clara Valente even mentioned this in her 2002 article with Speculum, that there's only really a handful of scholars, relatively speaking, who have given this lament any sort of attention, and it probably deserves a lot more attention because it's such an interesting piece of propaganda, and it's an interesting piece of propaganda because it seems as though it reflects the public mood of the monarchy at the time. And it also reflects and regurgitates, in some cases, the propaganda of two competing factions at the royal court.
So I guess we're going to have to DIY this. I'm going to have to actually find someone that can speak
Anglo-Norman French.
Anglo-Norman French, or was this translated into what in the 16th century?
Into English as it existed in the 16th century.
So someone who can speak, that variety of English. I know someone who can do it, but I might have to do that.
Yeah.
I guess in our final question here, was it typical for poetic laments to be political in nature? And where did that genre come from?
Right. So this is only one of two laments in English history where the monarch is speaking, in the first person. The other one was Edward IV at the end of the 15th century in 1483. But although his authorship is also, it seems very concocted. It seems like someone was obviously writing for him in that one as well. The other laments in English history, particularly in the 14th century, are written in the third person about the monarch. They're not supposed to represent the voice of the monarch in the first person. And for example, Edward II's father, there's a lament written about him that sort of, talks about his legacy and it's obviously very sad that it demonstrates a sadness that his firm reign is no longer a presence there in England, and it covers his achievements, and it sort of lionizes his achievements and his legacy. But the lament, I would say, is a much older genre, going back, and I'm almost fairly certain that they would have taken the laments in the Bible, the Book of Lamentations in the Bible, lamenting over the destruction of the first and then the second temple of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC and then the Romans in the 1st century AD. So medieval people today aren't like this, but people in medieval times, they were very well versed in biblical literature. They knew the Bible through and through. They even cited it when it came to law and when it came to behavior and warfare, like
Deuteronomy.
Butchering it.
It's fine.
Deuteronomic literature, for example, informed some of the English behavior when they invaded France and how they treated townspeople when they sacked their cities, for example. So these people are very steeped in biblical knowledge and literature and lore and.
Well, it's a relatively new phenomenon that we're not.
Yes, it is.
It's actually where we can have
in terms of the Western world,
right? Yeah. We can have a debate about whether or not that's a good or a bad thing, but it's something that's really interesting about doing all this curation and product and educational product development is just seeing how far that influence reached until very, very recently.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, during the Enlightenment, obviously, and during the 18th century, it perhaps became.
Obviously in Europe, but I mean in the United States even it went deeper. I think the thing is when you start making products like this, my perspective, just a bird's eye view, you should start to not look at a century or 2 or 3 centuries as being that long a period of time when you can see
relatively speaking,
the larger timeline.
Totally. Yeah.
So that raises an interesting question about larger timelines, and I think maybe actually that was our penultimate question. So this will be the ultimate question. I could probably talk to you about this stuff all day, but I have to get going. What if someone is not particularly interested in this poem or history or something like that? How would you make the case that they ought to care about this discussion that we just had? Why is this significant?
Yes. Yeah, so I would say this particular poem is significant in that it shows how not only medieval monarchies operated, but it can sort of show the process of the dissemination of propaganda, which is a relevant topic in any era of history.
Fake news.
Yeah. I mean, that's a relevant topic in the present day, let alone hundreds of years ago.
Well, that's what I was going to see. Is there a present day application to anything that we're talking about right now?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I'm thinking of like a modern day equivalent of releasing poetry and things like that. so in the medieval times, Edward II, when he invaded Scotland, he brought along a poet that was going to write this great, lovely song celebrating his victory. But instead, Edward II got defeated at Bannockburn. And so that poet's service was no longer needed.
No need to document that one.
Yeah, it better not, actually.
Yeah.
Probably save that poem for some other time.
It'll be a deep cut. We won't.
So, but a modern-day example of that would be something like, gosh, people going out, to blog or go online to produce a bunch of content to promote, a particular product or a politician or a movie star or some sort of promoter.
We see how the poem kind of functioned as a PR wing.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and
that's really interesting.
And back then, word of mouth was so much more important. I mean, when we think of word of mouth today, we think, well, I mean, yeah, that exists, but people go on Facebook, people go on Twitter, people go on all various social media sites to.
So the poem was an
word
effective way to communicate because it was it was easy to memorize.
Exactly,
and it lended itself to song and rhythm and meter, and like this was kind of like almost like a mnemonic device? Is that the word? Like a way to get people to remember certain things that are very important that you want to promulgate
through the medium of music. I mean, so through this, it would have been there's an obvious entertainment factor there because it's a musical lyrical poem, and it doesn't just reflect society's views of the monarchy at the time. It also would have served as an educational tool for people who weren't up to snuff or weren't up to speed with what was going on in the political sphere, and it was sort of like a means to, if it was designed that way by the court, it would have poems like that, and also royal decrees and other documents would have served as a sort of way of letting the public and the nobility know where the monarchy stood, what their views were, what their biases were, or their hidden biases. At least they didn't want to project, the idea that they were saying things falsely. And it would have been a word of mouth exercise with musicians or people who read literature at the time. Obviously, back then, there were a very small amount of people, a very small percentage of the population was literate. Mm-hmm. So the amount of people reading this poem would have been much smaller than the amount of people hearing it through the voices of a troubadour.
I am drawing so many analogies right now in my head. I mean, obviously, you can see what was going on in the 14th century and what we're trying to do right now by capturing the human voice and packaging ideas in a way. Yeah. The poem is, there's some analogy between podcasting and digital delivery mechanisms and that poem being spread by word of mouth.
Yeah, exactly.
And it worked then. Yeah. It's going to work now, too.
It definitely will work. People, and I think that touches upon, the key difference would be, back then, the musical version would have been aimed at people of lesser means, people who wouldn't be able to read the poem in the first place, and just the common public in general. Whereas today, I mean, when you emphasize audio in education and communications, this is something that someone can just have as a preference as opposed to reading. Because most people today in modern advanced first world nations are literate people. Yeah. So they can definitely consume it either way. It's just that I would say that the audio aspect of education is for students who want to get on a track where they learn better that way. Right. They learn better through they learn quicker through audio through an audio sort of experience. Right. Yeah.
It's just more economic that way. You can't read a book while you're driving a car.
No, you can't. Well, there's that too.
Yeah, there is a whole problem.
Convenience sake. Yeah. Thank God for modern convenience.
Yeah. Well, look, I learned a lot, man. This was exciting. I hope you had a lot of fun, I hope you want to do this again because I learned so much from you, and I think a lot of other people will learn a lot from you. So, anything else you'd like to say in closing? Because I probably need to head back.
I got you. Well, thank you, Luke. And I would say to anyone who's interested in 14th century poetry or medieval poetry in general, or any of the topics we discussed, feel free to look up that article by Claire
Valente
on JSTOR, or if you don't have access to JSTOR, you can look at Paul Studer's book, 1921 book, in archive.org or Google Archives, and there shouldn't be a mountain of material out there on the Lament of Edward II, but you'll find stuff at least through those two sources.
Well, we just added to it.
Yeah.
Maybe this will be help people find out about it. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks for listening. Go download the Noetic app. All right, bye.
Do it.